A lone scout steps into a valley where 60-mile winds bend spruce like wet reeds and rip snow sideways in blinding sheets. Everyone swears a lean-to can't survive a storm like this, but he sees a hidden pattern in the chaos. With only hours before the gale peaks, he gambles everything on a design no one believes can stand. What happens next defies every rule of frontier survival. The valley ahead lies in a muted gray haze, the sky swollen with fast-moving clouds that drag long shadows across the frozen ground. Every gust rolls in with a deep, pack-like growl, sweeping ripples over the crusted snowpack and lifting tiny shards that sting exposed skin. To most travelers, this place would feel abandoned, stripped clean by winter, and left with no hint of mercy. But to Elias Branton, a seasoned scout with a thin frame and a calm, analytical mind, the terrain offers more information than danger. Wind direction, slope angle, drift patterns, tree line breaks, each becomes a piece of the larger puzzle he must solve before nightfall. Behind him, several settlers on the migration trail had insisted that no shelter could stand in such screaming wind. They warned him not to waste time on a lean-to, claiming it would fold like a paper scrap the moment the gusts reached their full 60-mile force. But Elias had seen their wagons, heavy, stiff, poorly loaded against crosswinds, and knew their assumptions came from fear, not experience. He had also seen storms worse than this one, storms that twisted ridgetops into sculpted waves of frost and carved trenches 2 feet deep in a single night. This upcoming gale was dangerous, but not unknowable. He had studied storms since he was barely old enough to lift a trapping satchel, and he understood that the wilderness punished ignorance far more than it punished courage. The air temperature dips sharply as another gust unloads across the valley. Elias pauses long enough to feel the pressure shift, sensing the wind's rhythm the way a tracker senses the ground. He knows that if he stops moving for more than a few minutes, the wind chill will begin leaching heat from his body at a rate he cannot safely ignore. Already, his fingers carry that familiar numbness that warns him to work quickly. The nearest established shelter lies more than 12 miles away, too far for the conditions and too far for daylight. He must build something now, something sturdy, something grounded in technique rather than brute strength. His gaze sweeps across the landscape in slow, intentional arcs. Snow swirls into small spiraling columns near the base of a ridge, revealing where the wind accelerates and where it weakens. Elias watches how the gusts slide down from the escarpment and then split at the foot of the slope, dividing into 2 flowing currents. In the space between those currents lies a subtle pocket of reduced force, a natural wind shadow that most travelers would overlook because of its uneven ground and exposed roots. To Elias, however, the roots form anchors, and the uneven ground means stability. A lean-to built there might bend, shake, and moan under the storm, but it would not surrender easily. He moves toward the spot with steady, deliberate steps, leaving behind a drag of boot prints half-filled by drifting snow. A fallen spruce, stripped bare by earlier storms, lies nearby at a favorable angle. The tree's trunk curves slightly, a gentle bow formed by years of wind pressure. Elias studies it with a craftsman's eye, tracing the arc with his gloved fingers. A curve like this can become the spine of a shelter that doesn't fight the wind, but guides it. Most people forget that the wilderness rewards designs that cooperate, not resist. A lean-to that sheds wind rather than blocks it stands a far better chance of survival. A heavy gust crashes across the ridge and pushes a wave of snow over Elias's boots. He braces against it, leaning into the force, letting it test his stance. The gust is strong, but its movement is consistent. That consistency tells him something important. The primary wind direction won't shift drastically in the next few hours. If it did, he would see scatter patterns in the drifts or swirling vortices forming off the timberline. For now, the storm behaves like a single enormous tide, rising steadily and rolling westward across the valley. He understands storms like other men understand patterns in trade routes or maps. They are systems with motion, intention, and rhythm. Elias kneels near the base of the uprooted roots, brushing away snow to find the thick cradle of twisted wood that once held the spruce upright. To most people, The tangled mass would be nothing more than a dead structure, but to Elias it is a natural anchor. Nestling the ridgepole into this cradle will keep uplift forces from tearing the lean-to loose. He feels under the snow, testing the firmness of the roots, checking their depth, verifying the angle at which the ridgepole will rest. Every detail matters. Survival in a storm depends on decisions made in minutes, shaped by experience earned over years. A distant groan moves through the timberline as wind sweeps across it like a bow across a deep instrument. The sound is low and resonant, a reminder that the storm is strengthening. Elias knows he has less than an hour before the winds reach their full violence. The storm will not wait for him to finish. He must race it, match it, and eventually outsmart it. That urgency quickens his breath, but not his thoughts. His mind remains steady, calculating angles and load points, visualizing how each pole will distribute force across the shelter. He rises from the roots and turns toward the fallen spruce, measuring its length with his eyes. This will become the backbone of the structure, the defining line upon which every rib will depend. He grips one end of the trunk, testing its weight, estimating it at roughly 30 pounds, light enough to maneuver alone, but heavy enough to resist lifting winds when anchored properly. He begins dragging it toward the chosen site, boots carving shallow trenches across the frost. Behind him, the valley continues to howl, a wilderness voice that seems to declare its own supremacy. But Elias listens differently. He hears not a threat, but a warning, one that carries valuable information if interpreted correctly. The sound of the wind, the shape of the drifts, the sway of the remaining trees, each forms part of a message that only those who live close to the land can decode. The storm is still gathering strength, and Elias knows what comes next will decide everything. The place is chosen. The ridgepole is ready. The wind has revealed its direction. Now he must set the spine of the lean-to before the valley unleashes its full fury. As he plants his feet in the snow and lifts the curved spruce into place, the horizon darkens further, and a deeper roar begins to build beyond the ridge, one that signals a coming wave of wind unlike the gusts before it. At first light, he will face the storm's true force, but first he must survive the night-long battle to raise a shelter no one believes can stand. Early frontier scouts survived not because they were stronger than the storms, but because they could read the wilderness as if it were a moving, breathing map. Wind was never just wind, it was a messenger that revealed pressure lines, terrain weaknesses, and safe pockets hidden in chaos. Now, facing a valley under siege by 60-mile gusts, Elias Branton must use every lesson learned from older trappers who trusted patterns more than luck. What he is about to discover in this storm will challenge the limits of instinct and knowledge alike. The wind slams through the timber with renewed force as Elias circles the spot he intends to use for the lean-to's foundation. Snow whips around him in spiraling bursts that rise and collapse like small white funnels. His breath fogs thickly in the air, and each inhale brings a chill deep into his lungs. A storm like this has texture, layers of wind that move differently depending on where they touch ground. Elias senses that layered motion now. A low, dragging current sweeps close to the snow surface, while a higher band roars overhead with the force of a fast river. The two levels don't mix evenly. Instead, they create shifting pockets where gusts compress and release. This complexity is what makes storms dangerous for travelers who misread the signs, but Elias has been reading signs for as long as he can remember. He kneels next to the root cradle again, this time not to test the wood, but to feel the direction of the gusts brushing over the uneven ground. The wind's angle has tightened just enough for him to notice. It isn't a full shift, but a narrowing line that hints at a developing funnel. This means the valley is beginning to act like a wind corridor, a natural channel that accelerates gusts when the storm reaches its strongest phase. If he positions the lean-to even a few feet too far left or right, the structure could take the full brunt of the corridor instead of the gentler crossflow on its edge. The uncertainty adds another layer of tension, but Elias allows the concern to sharpen his focus rather than cloud it. He steps back from the cradle and studies the slope above. Drifts form at consistent angles, sharp on the windward side, tapered on the leeward. The pattern tells him exactly where the main gust line is hitting. The drifts closer to the ridgeline stand at nearly 30-degree angles, a perfect indicator of direction. Elias learned this from an older trapper named Thorn Hale, a man who could read snow the way some scouts read tracks. Thorn had once claimed that snow never lies. Elias didn't believe him then, but he believes him now as he watches the drifts paint a precise picture across the valley floor. He gathers a thin stalk of dried grass from beneath a spruce branch and releases it into the air. The grass swings sharply, bending toward the northwest. This confirms the drift reading. The valley winds are turning slightly, pulling the storm into a new rhythm. Elias watches how the grass vibrates as it falls, its trembling motion revealing turbulence near the ground. This tells him where the airflow becomes unpredictable, where he must absolutely avoid placing the shelter's open side. A lean-to doesn't fail because of weight alone. It fails when uplift forces slip under the roofline. He must place the shelter so that wind flows over it, not into it. He carries the information in silent, concentrated breaths, his mind aligning the signs into a system he can trust. The ridgepole he dragged into place in the previous hour gives him a fixed point to calculate from. He walks around the area once more, studying the angle between the ridgepole and the incoming wind. A lean-to should sit at a slight angle, not directly against the gusts and not perfectly parallel, because this allows wind to slide off instead of battering the structure directly. Elias estimates the angle at roughly 20 degrees, just enough to reduce pressure while still protecting him from the elements. Anyone watching him now might think he is simply pacing, but each step represents an evaluation, a test, a refinement of the plan forming in his mind. As he positions himself near the spruce trunk again, Elias notices how the snow collects in feathered ridges near the base of the roots. These tiny formations reveal the presence of a small wind shadow, the same pocket he located earlier. This confirms his earlier instinct. The site offers just enough shelter to create a workable foundation without exposing him to the main gust corridor. The find steadies him. In storms like this, even a single confirmed detail can shift the balance from uncertainty to confidence. Still, he must account for danger above. He looks up at the surrounding trees, checking for loose branches, widowmakers that often drop without warning during heavy gusts. Though the trees sway aggressively, none show the distinctive torsion that signals imminent breakage. The risk remains, but manageable. He reminds himself of the unwritten rule all scouts follow. Storms reward caution, not fear. Fear freezes judgment, while caution preserves it. He moves toward a cluster of saplings at the edge of the clearing. By watching how their thin trunks sway, he can assess the gust rhythm. When the saplings whip in unison, the storm is hitting a synchronized pressure band. When they move separately, the gusts splinter across the valley. The saplings move in near-perfect unison now. The coordinated motion tells him the storm has reached a transitional stage, one where winds become steadier but stronger. This is both good and bad. Good because consistent wind is predictable, bad because predictable doesn't mean gentle. The lean-to must be set before the storm finishes this transition, or it will be too dangerous to keep working. A fresh gust barrels down the valley and slaps against the slope with such force that snow lifts in a broad sheet. Elias squints through the blur and sees what he expected. The wind line is flattening slightly as it approaches the ravine. This means he will have more side-slanting gusts than direct hits. The shelter must take advantage of that. A lean-to built in the wrong direction would trap the gusts like a funnel and collapse in minutes. He returns to the ridgepole and measures the line between its base and the root cradle. The placement feels right. He can already visualize how the ribs will arc over the pole, how the bark shingles will lie, how the snow seals will pack against the windward side. The lean-to exists in his mind before it exists in the world, and that mental blueprint is what keeps him calm amid rising turbulence. The valley's roar deepens, a low rolling sound that seems to grow from beneath the ground rather than above it. The storm is preparing to release its next surge. Elias feels it in the air's pressure, in the way the cold seems to tighten around him like a slow-moving vice. The time for reading signs has ended. The time for building has arrived. Yet before he begins, something catches his eye. Near the base of the root cradle, half hidden under a drift, lies a small depression he didn't notice before. It is subtle, but its shape suggests a natural hollow that could stabilize the ridgepole even more securely. If he uses it correctly, it could mean the difference between the shelter bending under the storm or holding firm through the night. The discovery sends a ripple of urgency through him, sharpening the moment into sudden clarity. What he uncovers in that hidden hollow will force him to rethink the lean-to's entire spine before the storm reaches its full fury. Every frontier structure begins with a question of timber, and the answer determines whether the wilderness will tolerate its presence. Wood that bends at the wrong moment becomes a liability, but wood that yields gracefully under pressure becomes a partner in survival. As the storm gathers strength across the valley, Elias Branton must choose the material that will decide whether his lean-to stands against the coming fury or folds beneath it. What he selects now will shape the outcome of the night. The depression beneath the roots draws his attention with almost magnetic pull. Snowdrifts had masked it earlier, but now the hollow reveals itself as a narrow but well-defined pocket, formed when the tree tore free from the ground seasons ago. Elias crouches beside it, brushing away loose snow until he exposes the packed soil beneath. The hollow runs at a natural angle, tilting slightly upward toward the ridge. That tilt is important. It means any ridgepole he seats here will rest against a resistant slope rather than sliding backward under the storm's push. The root cradle alone would have been enough for anchoring, but this additional feature provides a second point of stabilization, a detail that changes everything. He studies the hollow with the careful observation of someone who knows the wilderness rarely gives free advantages. The soil is firm despite the cold, and the roots surrounding it twist in strong, unbroken arcs. Anchoring the ridgepole here means the spine of the lean-to will sit deeper, lowering the center of gravity and reducing uplift forces by a margin that could prove critical in a 60-mile gale. The realization strengthens his resolve and sharpens his next decision: to select the exact timber that will define the structure's durability. Elias rises and moves toward the fallen spruce he had inspected earlier. Its curved trunk, shaped by years of living under wind pressure, already feels like the natural choice. He lifts one end again, testing its weight, balancing it across his shoulder and sensing the slight flex near the midpoint. Green spruce offers both resilience and flexibility, two qualities essential for a shelter designed to shed wind rather than resist it outright. Dry wood cracks under torsion, but green wood bows without surrendering. Elias presses his thumb into the exposed grain and feels the faint moisture inside, evidence that the trunk is still alive enough to flex safely. Yet he does not rely on instinct alone. He moves to a cluster of younger spruce trees still standing near the slope. Their trunks measure between 4 and 6 inches in diameter, ideal dimensions for supporting ribs or reinforcing braces. Elias grips one of the thinner trunks and gently pulls it forward, testing how the tree responds to pressure. The bend is smooth, with no sharp cracks or sudden twists. This tells him the wood carries even moisture throughout, another necessary trait for a structure facing unpredictable wind. He checks another, applying slightly more force, feeling for weaknesses. The tree bends cleanly before returning to its original shape. He notes this mentally. Timber that behaves predictably is the safest to cut. He returns to the fallen spruce and begins trimming the remaining branches with calm precision. The blade of his hand tool slices through each limb with rhythmic efficiency, sending small clusters of green needles to the snow. The cuts are clean, and the trimmed trunk reveals its naturally bowed shape more clearly. Elias moves around it, checking the curvature from several angles. A curved ridgepole is essential because it guides wind upward, allowing the lean-to to behave not as a barrier but as a shaped surface that encourages airflow. Scouts with less experience often choose straight logs, believing symmetry equals strength. But Elias knows that in wind-heavy terrain, curves work with the weather, not against it. When the ridgepole is fully prepared, he drags it back to the root cradle, feeling the strain in his muscles as snow drags against the wood. Despite the cold, sweat gathers beneath his layers, but he keeps a steady pace, knowing that time is slipping away as the storm intensifies. Upon reaching the site, he lifts the front end of the ridgepole and angles it into the hollow. The fit is nearly perfect. The curve of the trunk aligns with the cradle's tilt, locking into place with a satisfying sense of stability. The moment the wood settles, Elias feels the structure begin to take shape, not physically yet, but conceptually. The spine is everything. Once it is set, the rest of the shelter becomes a matter of proper assembly. He steps back to evaluate the placement. The ridgepole now sits at a 25-degree angle relative to the direct wind line, an orientation that will encourage gusts to slide across its length rather than strike it head-on. The angle also allows for optimized rib spacing later, ensuring each support pole bears equal responsibility for distributing the stress of the storm. This is not just a build, it is an experiment in harmonizing with nature's pressure systems, and Elias senses the weight of that responsibility. Next, he searches for secondary timber, poles for bracing and rib supports. The storm continues to escalate, sending finer particles of snow into the air that swirl in quick, sharp spirals. Elias works through the trees, selecting saplings that match the necessary dimensions, 4 to 5 inches in diameter, 9 to 10 feet long. He cuts them, trims them, and stacks them against a sheltered patch of ground. Each selection requires attention. Timber that feels too rigid will snap under stress. Wood that is too flexible will fail to provide structural support. The balance between rigidity and give defines whether the structure will endure the night. As he prepares to lift the next support pole, the wind surges across the valley with a sharp, rising howl, carrying with it a blast of cold so intense it momentarily steals his breath. The storm's voice has changed. Its rhythm no longer matches the earlier gusts. Something new is developing, something heavier, more forceful, more decisive. Elias plants the pole into the snow, but before he secures it, he pauses, listening carefully to the shift in sound patterns. Beyond the tree line, the storm forms a corridor of accelerating wind, and Elias realizes he must build directly in its mouth before it closes around him. The storm tightens its grip over the valley, squeezing the air until it vibrates in a low, rolling hum that feels almost alive. Snow blasts sideways in long silver ribbons and rattles through the trees like a handful of nails thrown across a frozen table. Any misstep now could undo hours of calculation. Yet Elias Branton moves with the focused calm of someone who knows that the smallest decision might determine whether the lean-to survives the night. He is ready to challenge the storm, but the storm is equally ready to test him. The wind corridor forming beyond the tree line pushes a steady wall of pressure toward the slope. Elias stands in its path, feeling the gusts buffet against him with intensities rising and falling like a tide. The corridor is narrowing, tightening with each passing minute as the storm reorganizes itself. This is the moment when weather becomes deceptive, when the gusts that feel predictable shift into a new pattern designed by terrain, temperature, and pressure. Elias studies the movement, knowing the lean-to spine must be locked in place before this corridor closes fully. If he misinterprets the behavior of the wind, the shelter will take a direct hit from forces stronger than any structure of wood and bark should endure. He places the first support pole into position near the ridgepole, pressing its base firmly into the snow. The ridgepole sits deep within the root cradle and angled hollow, but until the ribs are attached, it lacks lateral stability. Wind loads strike differently from each side, and without the ribs, even a strong anchor could twist under unpredictable uplift. Elias feels the ridgepole tremble faintly as another gust rolls through. The vibration does not alarm him, rather it confirms the structure is interacting with the wind as expected. What matters is how he guides that force. A lean-to that fights the wind will lose. A lean-to that redirects it stands a chance. He moves to retrieve more poles, dragging them one by one from the stack he assembled earlier. When he returns to the ridgepole, the storm sends another blast of air across the slope, lifting a spray of snowflakes that strike his coat with rapid-fire taps. He drops to one knee, keeping his movements controlled, and angles the first rib pole against the ridgepole. The alignment must be exact. Too steep, and the rib will catch wind instead of shedding it. Too shallow, and the structure loses strength and collapses under weight. Elias tests the angle by pressing down on the midpoint of the rib, listening to the muted creak of wood responding to pressure. The pole flexes evenly. The angle is right. He adjusts the placement slightly before leaning his full weight into the rib to anchor it into the packed snow. The ground beneath him has hardened from cold accumulation, providing a solid base. He presses until the pole settles into a tight position. Even with the storm strengthening, the rib holds steady. Elias moves around the structure, breathing heavily as he checks alignment from multiple sides. Every rib must contribute equally, or the shelter will develop weak spots, regions where wind can pry at edges and lift the structure from beneath. Snow begins collecting on the ridgepole as the storm sweeps over it. Elias clears it away with a quick brush of his hand and returns to the work. He places the second rib, then the third, building a pattern that follows the natural arc of the ridgepole. Each rib sits at a slightly different angle to accommodate the curve, forming a slanted shape designed to guide wind upward instead of allowing it to slam directly into the shelter's surface. The structure begins to resemble the skeleton of a shelter, a framework that promises protection if completed before the storm reaches its next surge. A sudden burst of wind strikes the slope so hard that Elias instinctively leans into the gust, bracing against the pressure. Snow swirls in tight spirals around his boots, drawing circles that dissolve as quickly as they form. The valley emits a deep, resonant groan, a sound that travels through the ground and settles into the bones. Elias knows this tone. It means the storm is entering its compression phase, a stage where wind banks against the landscape and compresses into stronger, sharper blasts. These blasts will not come in steady waves, but in unpredictable bursts. He must finish installing the remaining ribs before the pattern becomes too erratic. He works quicker now, not recklessly, but with practiced efficiency. His breath fogs around his face as he lifts the next rib pole and positions it beside the ridge pole. The wood vibrates faintly in his hands, reacting to the wind even before he sets it. Elias braces it with his knee while adjusting the angle. Once it feels right, he presses it into the snow with a deep, steady push. The rib locks into place, creating another line of support that strengthens the framework. As he steps back, he watches the wind skim across the emerging structure. The ribs shake, but they shake together, not independently, a crucial sign that the lean-to is forming a unified body rather than a collection of disconnected poles. This unity allows the shelter to distribute force across multiple points rather than absorbing pressure through a single line. Elias feels a flicker of reassurance, but he does not allow confidence to drift into complacency. The storm is still building. He positions another rib, then another, listening to each one as it settles into place. He presses on them gently to evaluate their resistance, noticing how the wood responds with subtle bends rather than brittle snaps. This is why he chose green spruce. It learns the storm's rhythm as easily as he does, bending when it must, holding when required. The lean-to begins to resemble a curved shield nestled against the roots, an organic shape born from necessity rather than design. The wind corridor beyond the tree line narrows even more, its force increasing as the storm compresses the air into a smaller channel. The gusts now strike in heavy, uneven bursts that rattle the ridgepole. Elias feels the pressure shift across the structure, testing the ribs he has installed. The shelter holds, but he knows it is still incomplete. Without braces to secure the ribs and prevent lateral twisting, the entire structure remains vulnerable. The next step must be completed before conditions worsen. He lifts another support pole, feeling the rough bark catch against his gloves. He positions it across two ribs, imagining where braces will distribute force and strengthen the frame. But as he studies the structure, a deeper, more pressing concern forms in his mind. The wind no longer sounds like a single force. It has split. Two currents now sweep across the valley, one from the northwest and another from the north-northeast, creating cross-pattern turbulence that will challenge every decision he has made so far. The lean-to must withstand pressure from more than one direction. Elias steps back, fully aware that the next moments will determine whether the lean-to survives or fails. He listens closely to the shifting wind, waiting for the storm to reveal its next move. Winter will judge this choice soon, and the storm's next surge will test the shelter before he can finish reinforcing it. A lean-to stands or collapses depending on the strength of its ribs, and in hurricane-level winds those ribs must bend like living branches rather than resist like rigid beams. Elias Branton knows that each pole he sets carries the weight of his survival, but time is closing in fast as the storm's pressure builds into a pulsing, unpredictable rhythm. Every decision must be precise, because one misplaced rib could unravel the entire structure. The storm is ready to decide his fate, but he is ready to shape the outcome before it strikes. The wind's two new currents crash together in uneven surges that send sudden shivers across the frame of the lean-to. Elias feels each vibration as he stands beside the ribs he has already installed, pressing his gloved hand against the ridgepole to sense how deeply the gusts push into the structure. The wood trembles but does not yield. The ribs quiver together, an encouraging sign that the shelter's skeleton is beginning to accept the load. But the storm is not done reshaping its own strength. Elias must now reinforce the ribs with careful consistency, turning raw poles into a unified shield that can breathe with the wind instead of breaking beneath it. He retrieves another pole from the pile, this one slightly longer and thicker than the rest. Its grain runs clean and straight, with just enough natural curve to complement the ridgepole's bowed shape. Elias examines the bark, noting its tightness, which signals internal moisture and flexible fibers. He presses the pole into the snow, testing its responsiveness. The wood bends with a smooth, controlled arc. This is good. A rib that bows under pressure can transfer force to its neighbors, preventing the lean-to from taking damage in a single point. He carries the pole to the ridgepole, judging the spacing between the existing ribs with careful precision. The spacing must remain consistent, 8 to 12 inches, because uneven gaps create pressure traps where wind finds purchase and digs into the structure. Elias positions the rib at a slight angle, leaning it into the ridgepole, then leans his body weight against it to press the base deeper into the snow. The pole sinks into the crusted layer before meeting resistance in the packed ground beneath, anchoring firmly. He holds it in place, allowing the storm's gusts to strike it for a few moments. The rib bends, but remains steady. Elias nods to himself and releases it, satisfied that the structure has gained another line of defense. Snow begins collecting along the upper edge of the emerging lean-to, forming small ridges that reveal how the wind is sliding across the surface. Elias steps to the side to observe the snow patterns more clearly. The drifts tell him whether the airflow is smooth or turbulent. Right now, the snow falls in a consistent sheet, flowing down the ribs like water rolling over stones. This means the angle is correct. If the snow had swirled upward or curled back into the shelter, it would have signaled a design flaw he would need to correct. But the flow remains smooth, and that gives him confidence to continue placing ribs before the storm strengthens further. He gathers 2 more poles, laying them parallel on the ground while he checks their shape. One has a subtle curve at the base, which would create a gap in the lower section of the shelter if used incorrectly. The other is straighter but slightly thicker. Elias decides to use the curved pole for the upper right section, where its natural shape will help guide airflow away from the lean-to. The straight one will serve as reinforcement on the lower left side, where more stability is needed due to the storm's changing angles. Working quickly, he positions the curved pole first, planting it firmly into the snow and adjusting its angle until it rests cleanly against the ridgepole. He presses down on it with both hands, feeling the wood respond with a slight give that reassures him he has chosen well. The wind slams into the ribs again, stronger than before, and the entire frame shifts slightly. Elias moves around the structure, checking whether the ribs sway uniformly. If one rib shakes more than the rest, it will become a weak point. But the movement is synchronized, like reeds bowing together in a river current. The lean-to is learning the storm's rhythm. He returns to the straight pole and sets it into place on the opposite side, pressing it deep into the hardened snow. This rib feels more rigid, but its position near the base provides essential stability to counter the force of the low-level gusts sweeping close to the ground. Elias leans against it, testing its strength, and feels only a slight vibration. The ribs on either side absorb some of the pressure, confirming that the structure is distributing load correctly. This balance between rigidity and flexibility is what will determine whether the shelter endures the storm's peak. With the primary ribs in place, Elias begins adding secondary supports. These shorter poles act as interlocking braces, tying the ribs together and preventing lateral twisting. He positions the first brace across 2 ribs at shoulder height, adjusting its placement until it fits snugly. Once set, he secures it by pressing both ends into the snow, allowing the natural tension of the wood to hold it firmly. The brace stabilizes the ribs immediately, reducing their independent movement. Elias repeats the process with a second brace, then a third, forming a triangular pattern that strengthens the structure without adding unnecessary weight. The storm responds with another violent surge, one that sends sharp cracks through the valley as gusts whip through the trees. Elias braces himself against the ridgepole while snow blasts across his face. The lean-to flexes, but holds. The ribs bend in unison, and the braces absorb the twisting forces. For the first time, Elias senses that the shelter is transitioning from a vulnerable frame into a structure capable of enduring the night. But the storm is not finished. It is shifting again. The wind's rhythm changes, becoming more intermittent, more unpredictable. The gusts no longer arrive in strong, unified bursts. Instead, they come in staggered strikes, one heavy, one light, one sharp, one long. This pattern is far more dangerous. Consistent gusts can be planned for, but erratic ones create pressure imbalances that test every joint, every angle, every rib in ways no builder can fully predict. Elias watches as the snow scours the ground on the east side of the shelter, revealing patches of earth beneath the white. The wind is starting to attack from angles that threaten to pry at the ribs. He steps to the back of the shelter and pushes against the ridgepole, feeling how the force travels through the entire frame. The structure reacts with a deeper vibration than before. It is stable but strained, holding strong but not yet prepared for the storm's full unpredictability. Elias must act quickly to complete the next part of the build before the wind destabilizes the ribs he has worked so hard to secure. He looks toward the small pile of bark sheets he gathered earlier, material essential for sealing the ribs and creating the wind-shedding surface. The shelter cannot endure the storm without them. The moment has arrived for the next crucial phase. A sudden shift in the storm's direction forces Elias to accelerate his plans, for what he sees forming in the clouds will demand immediate sealing before the lean-to faces the next assault. As the storm darkens into an iron-blue haze, snow begins to travel not downward but sideways, slicing across the valley in long, blistering sheets. The wind sharpens into a cold blade that tests every joint in the lean-to's unfinished frame. Elias Branton knows he must seal the structure now before the next band of the storm hits with full, unforgiving force. The lean-to skeleton is strong, but without a skin, it will not survive what is coming. The sky loses its color as Elias gathers the bark sheets he collected earlier in the build. They lay piled at the edge of the work area, their surfaces rough with frost and curled like natural shingles waiting to be placed. Each sheet varies in width and length, some nearly 3 feet long, some only 1. He selects the largest first, knowing they will anchor the initial layer, and brushes the snow off their surfaces. The cold stiffens his gloves, but he keeps his movements steady. The storm's tone has shifted, becoming deeper, and the air carries the unmistakable weight of an approaching gust cycle. He must work within the storm's rhythm, placing each shingle in the brief pockets of calm between blasts. He steps toward the lean-to and presses the first bark sheet against the ribs. Its natural curvature fits the frame well, and Elias nestles it beneath the ridgepole, ensuring the root end points downward. The overlapping direction matters. It prevents wind from lifting the bark and tearing the structure apart. He unfurls the next sheet, sliding it beneath the first with practiced precision. The edges align like layered scales, forming a protective barrier that promises to shed the wind rather than catch it. He presses each piece tightly into place, listening to the muted creak of wood adjusting under pressure. As he adds more bark, the storm releases a violent surge that slaps against the frame with such force that snow bursts upward in a white cloud. Elias braces against the ridgepole, feeling the lean-to react with a sharp tremor. The ribs bend inward but recover, their positions held firm by the braces he installed. Snow sprays across his face, turning his breath into thick frost. The gust tries to pry at the bark sheets, but they hold. Elias takes the moment of resistance as confirmation he cannot slow down. The storm is entering a stronger phase, and every second now counts. He returns to the pile and gathers another set of bark sheets, choosing ones with rougher surfaces. These create friction when overlapped, strengthening the seal. The wind picks up again, whipping his coat and making his footing uncertain. Yet he moves deliberately, guided by instinct and the need to finish before the storm makes sealing impossible. He angles the next bark sheet precisely, positioning it to cover a gap between two ribs. The structure leans at just the right angle now, encouraging wind to sweep over rather than into the shelter. Snow continues falling in sideways streams, coating the lean-to in a thin, shimmering layer. Elias uses the fresh snow as part of the construction, packing it tightly into the gaps between bark sheets. Snow acts as a natural sealant in freezing temperatures, locking the bark into place once it hardens. He grabs handfuls of powder and presses them along the edges, forming dense, cold seals that will freeze solid when the temperature drops again. The process chills his hands through his gloves, but he works through the discomfort, knowing this step is vital. He shifts to the windward side of the lean-to and examines how the air slips across the structure. The airflow looks smooth, indicated by the way snow glides off the surface without swirling back. Elias nods at the sight. It means the angle is correct. Still, he reinforces the windward side with pine boughs, placing them between the bark layers to create a cushion that absorbs gust shock. The needles catch and hold snow, forming a cold, insulated panel that strengthens the shelter's resistance to wind penetration. He presses the boughs firmly, anchoring them between the ribs until they no longer shift when the wind howls through the valley. As he works, the storm intensifies again, sending a roar through the trees that reverberates across the landscape. The valley trembles under the force, and the lean-to's ribs shudder in response. Elias crouches low, listening as wind slaps against the bark and boughs. The sound is different now, less hollow, more muted, because the shelter has begun to take shape as a unified whole. The skin is forming, and the storm is acknowledging it. He moves toward the back of the lean-to, where a gap near the base remains unsealed. Cold air snakes through it, chilling the interior. Elias retrieves more bark sheets, arranging them into a second overlapping layer. He presses the edges tightly, then fills the remaining spaces with snow, packing it with the heel of his hand. The snow stiffens almost immediately, forming a compacted barrier that prevents gusts from slipping beneath the shelter. The storm shifts direction slightly, turning its energy into a sharper, colder blast that sweeps across the slope. Elias steps outside the lean-to and observes how the shelter handles the change. Wind skims across the bark, rolling over the ribs in a smooth arc without digging into the structure. It is the first sign that the lean-to, though unfinished, has begun to cooperate with the storm rather than fight it. Yet he cannot let that fleeting success slow him. The storm is not finished, and the hardest part may still be forming beyond the ridgeline. He crawls inside the lean-to for the first time, studying how the interior feels under pressure. The space is tight but insulated. The ribs arch overhead like the frame of a primitive wooden wing, and the bark sheets create a dim, filtered light that softens the storm's presence. The interior temperature remains brutally cold, but the air is still, protected from the chaotic gusts tearing across the valley. Elias pushes outward on the ribs from inside, feeling how they respond. The wood bends naturally, absorbing the pressure, but redistributing it evenly across the frame. The structure has potential. Still, to call the shelter complete would be a mistake. The upper ridge needs reinforcement to prevent uplifting forces from prying at the bark from beneath. Elias crawls out and begins layering a final set of bark sheets along the topmost section. These sheets create a weighted overlap that tightens the seal. He packs snow along the upper edges and steps down hard to compress it. When he finishes, he examines his work from a distance, noting how the entire lean-to now blends almost seamlessly into the landscape. A storm might overlook it entirely, mistaking it for a natural formation rather than a man-made structure. But as he studies the ridgeline, a new sound rises, a low, distant roar unlike the gusts before it. The timber is deeper, heavier, and carries with it the unmistakable signature of compressed air being funneled into a narrow channel. Elias watches the clouds shift, their underbellies darkening into a deep steel gray. What he sees forming above the valley forces him to realize the storm is preparing its harshest blow yet. A roar rises from the ravine, racing straight toward the lean-to, and Elias knows the storm's most dangerous wall of wind is about to strike. This is the moment every frontier scout prepares for, though no amount of training can ever make it feel routine. The first wave of a storm tests a shelter's construction, but the second wave, the rebound surge formed when wind ricochets off frozen ground, decides whether that shelter will remain standing. Elias Branton has built the lean-to with precision and instinct, yet now he must face the storm's harshest examination, a collision of forces that few structures and even fewer people survive without consequence. The roar from the ravine grows louder, rising from a distant rumble into a deep, rolling thunder that vibrates through the valley floor. Elias stands just outside the lean-to, his boots planted firmly in the snow as he braces himself against the incoming pressure. The wind gathers speed, sweeping across the slope with an aggression that feels almost deliberate. Within seconds, it strikes the lean-to in a heavy, slanted wave. The ribs bow under the impact, flexing downward like drawn bows, while the ridgepole groans beneath the sudden load. Elias moves back toward the structure, pressing his hands against the bark-covered surface to feel how the force disperses. The lean-to flexes but holds, its curves guiding the wind upward instead of resisting it. The structure's survival depends on that principle, yielding without breaking. Snow scours the ground around him, exposing patches of frozen earth. The gusts attack from multiple angles now, funneled through the narrowing corridor that has formed between the ravine walls. Elias watches how the valley reacts to the shift in airflow. Vortices spin off the slope, rising like small whirlwinds before dissolving into the storm. Above them, swirling streaks of snow trace the chaotic motions of the wind as it ricochets off ridges and rebounds into new directions. Elias has studied these patterns his entire life. Storm behavior is not random. It follows rules the wilderness created long before humans attempted to understand them. He crouches near the base of the lean-to and presses his shoulder gently against the lowest rib. The pressure flowing through the structure has changed, tightening along the lower supports. This is the danger of storm rebound. It funnels wind into unexpected pathways, pushing upward into the shelter's vulnerable underside. If the uplift becomes too strong, it can peel bark sheets loose or twist the ribs out of alignment. Elias listens carefully as the wind howls through the ribs. The sound is sharp but not fractured. That tells him the shelter is distributing force correctly. Still, he knows the lean-to needs extra support in one critical area, the lower midsection where uplift pressure concentrates. He retreats to the supply of leftover poles lying partially buried in a drift. These shorter lengths had not yet found purpose in the build, but they now become vital components. He selects 2 poles, each about 3 feet long, and tests their flexibility with a firm push. They bend cleanly without cracking. Good. These will serve as emergency cross braces. He positions the first brace diagonally across 2 ribs, pressing its ends into the snow until the natural tension of the wood wedges it securely into place. Then he installs the second brace in a mirrored pattern, forming a subtle X-shaped reinforcement that stabilizes the lower section of the structure. Another burst of wind slams into the lean-to. This one carries a sharper, higher-pitched tone, a sign that the storm is entering an advanced compression cycle. Elias feels the frame vibrate beneath the impact, but the new braces absorb a portion of the force, reducing the strain on the ribs. He moves along the side of the shelter, checking each rib by pressing his hand against it, gauging how deeply the vibrations travel. Most of the ribs respond with soft, uniform tremors. Only one near the upper right corner shakes with more intensity. This rib may be a weak point, one that could become unstable as the storm progresses. He retrieves another short pole and places it across the problem rib, securing it tightly between its neighbors. The additional brace calms the shaking almost immediately. Elias nods, feeling a small swell of reassurance. The structure is learning how to resist the storm's pressure, adjusting as he strengthens each vulnerable angle. But he knows he cannot relax. The valley has begun to produce a new phenomenon, something that emerges during only the most powerful winter storms. As the wind rebounds off the slopes, it creates rolling sound waves that pulse through the air. These pulses produce vibrations that are not felt immediately, but accumulate inside structures, stressing them from within. Elias hears it now, a low, rhythmic hum that rises and falls with the storm's breath. The lean-to resonates slightly, responding to the vibrations like the body of a wooden instrument. If the internal resonance aligns with the storm's pressure waves, the structure could shake itself apart. Scouts rarely talk about this danger, but Elias learned it from an older mountain guide who once described it as the storm's hidden hand. He presses his ear gently against the interior wall of the lean-to. The interior resonance is subtle, not yet dangerous, but he can sense it growing. He must modify the airflow around the shelter to break the developing harmony between wind and structure. He grabs a set of smaller pine boughs and begins packing them along the windward side, creating an uneven outer texture. Smooth surfaces invite resonant waves, irregular surfaces disperse them. The boughs bristle outward like natural armor, catching snow and disrupting airflow. Elias watches the snow patterns shift as he works. Instead of sliding off in smooth lines, they break apart, scattering unpredictably, exactly what he wants. The wind attacks again with increased force, sending another vibration across the lean-to. This time, the structure absorbs the shock with more balance, the bracing and uneven surface working together to diffuse the storm's energy. Elias crouches against the frame, feeling each pulse with heightened awareness. The storm is trying new patterns, searching for weakness. That is how violent weather behaves, testing, probing, shifting, waiting for the moment when pressure and angle align to exploit a flaw. But Elias refuses to give it one. He circles to the back of the shelter, where the slope rises behind the roots. Snow has piled up there, forming a small mound. He scoops additional snow with his hands and packs it tightly against the base of the structure. Snow is not only insulation, it is a stabilizing mass. By creating a cold berm behind the ribs, he strengthens the shelter's resistance to backward force. The berm freezes almost instantly, locking itself into the contours of the lean-to. Elias presses against it with his shoulder to test its rigidity. The mound holds firm. Another gust strikes, this one faster, sharper than the others. The lean-to reacts with a heavy shudder that rattles the ridgepole. Elias leans into the structure, bracing it with his body, listening for any crack or split. None come. Yet the wind does not retreat. It lingers, pushing and twisting the shelter, as if the valley itself is trying to pry the ribs from the snow. Elias steadies his breath, recognizing the test for what it is. The storm is changing shape, preparing to release its most turbulent form. The sky overhead begins to churn, the clouds lowering and tightening into new formations. The valley darkens, and the temperature drops again, piercing deeper than before. But the price for survival is about to surface, for the storm's next shift will demand a sacrifice the lean-to, or Elias, may not be ready to give. The wind shifts again, this time from an angle no scout ever hopes to face. Cross gusts are the storm's most unpredictable weapon, ambushing a shelter from the side and ripping at joints that were never designed to take such abuse. Elias Branton has spent the last hours shaping the lean-to work with the storm, but now the storm refuses cooperation. It approaches with a new strategy, testing every ounce of his resilience and forcing him to rethink the terrain beneath his feet. The sky above the valley swirls into a darker hue, as though the storm is drawing in its breath before launching its next assault. Elias stands at the edge of the lean-to and watches the clouds tighten into overlapping layers, each shifting in a slightly different direction. This visual twist is a warning sign. The gust patterns are no longer unified. The storm is preparing cross-lateral blasts capable of twisting the lean-to sideways, prying at the ribs he has reinforced through sweat and determination. For a brief moment, Elias feels the weight of the unknown settle onto his shoulders. But fear is not useful here. Observation is. He steps to the side of the lean-to, crouching low to study how snow travels near the ground. The flakes no longer move in straight lines, but cross each other, forming distorted spirals that scatter unpredictably. This behavior indicates that the wind is beginning to curl inward, pulling from the flank rather than pushing from the front. Elias places his hand on the lowest rib, expecting a consistent tremor, but instead he feels a staggered vibration, a clear sign the emerging gusts will target weaknesses he has not yet accounted for. He must find a way to break the crossflow before it destabilizes the entire structure. To counter this shift, Elias studies the slope above the lean-to. The terrain rises at a gentle angle before dropping sharply into the valley, creating an elevated shelf where snow accumulates in uneven patches. If he can adjust the airflow around the shelter, he might force the storm to pass over it rather than into its flank. He retrieves handfuls of snow and packs them tightly along the windward side, building a small berm that mirrors the natural shape of the slope. The berm grows quickly, forming a barrier that redirects wind upward. Elias tests the airflow by observing how the snowdrifts respond, and he sees the flakes lift slightly before reaching the lean-to. The adjustment works, but not fully. The cross gusts remain erratic, slipping through gaps in the terrain and striking from unexpected angles. Elias returns to the lean-to and inspects the ribs along the side most threatened by the new wind direction. One rib near the center shakes with a deeper, heavier tremor than the others. Though the braces help distribute some pressure, the cross gusts are beginning to peel the outer bark layers back, lifting them like small flaps. A single lifted flap can lead to a chain reaction, allowing wind to dive beneath the layered shingles and tear the ceiling apart. Elias presses the bark back down, packing snow around the edges to reinforce the adhesion. Snow is both vulnerability and strength. When used correctly, it turns into a bond as solid as wood. He gathers pine boughs from the pile he had saved earlier, selecting branches with thick needles capable of disrupting airflow. He wedges them between the ribs on the exposed side, creating a textured surface that breaks the wind's grip. The needles scatter the gusts, causing them to lose cohesion before striking the structure. Elias watches the effect almost immediately. The wind no longer slams the lean-to in a single forceful strike, but breaks apart into weaker, fragmented pressures. It is not a perfect solution, but it buys him time, and in this storm, time is survival. The crossflow strengthens again, shifting several degrees east. Snow swirls around Elias in erratic bursts, stinging his cheeks with sharp cold. He braces himself against the ridgepole and listens. The lean-to produces a deep, rhythmic creak, not from failure, but from the sheer weight of the wind's renewed assault. Elias feels the vibration travel through the timber and into the ground beneath his boots. He knows he must anticipate the storm's next move. If the wind increases from this angle, the pressure will slide along the ribs and attempt to rotate the structure sideways. He needs one more method of anchoring, one that relies less on wood and more on the terrain itself. He turns toward the slope behind the lean-to and begins digging into the snow with his hands, carving out a shallow trench. The cold bites at his fingers, but he works quickly, shaping the trench into a curved channel that leads wind away from the shelter. This technique, something he learned from observing natural drifts near riverbanks, redirects airflow subtly but effectively. Once the trench is deep enough, he packs the sides with snow, pressing it until the walls firm up like a frozen chute. The trench creates a downward path, encouraging the crossflow to follow the curve instead of slamming directly into the lean-to. When the next gust arrives, Elias watches closely. The wind hits the slope, follows the trench, and slides past the lean-to in a smoother, drawn-out flow. The ribs shake less violently. The bark remains in place. The braces hold. Relief washes through him, but he knows the storm is far from finished. Crossflow rarely remains stable. It evolves, twists, and sharpens as the storm's core rotates. He steps forward to inspect the structure, running his hand over the ribs to feel for lingering stress. The valley groans again, though the tone is different now, lower, heavier, more concentrated. Elias turns his attention to the ravine, where wind has begun funneling into a sharper line. This new pattern threatens to combine with the crossflow he has just mitigated, forming a compound gust capable of striking the lean-to diagonally. Diagonal gusts are the most dangerous. They combine uplift, lateral shove, and downward pressure into one unpredictable force. Elias kneels beside the structure, reinforcing the lower berm by kicking snow toward the base with quick, powerful motions. The mound grows thicker, forming a frozen buttress that supports the weakest section of the lean-to. Even this reinforcement may not be enough, but he refuses to let the storm decide the outcome without giving the shelter every advantage possible. The temperature drops again, cutting through his coat with a sharper chill. Elias pulls his collar tighter and studies the airflow one last time. The wind has become quieter for the moment, not because it is weakening, but because it is pulling back, gathering strength for another surge. The valley waits in a tense stillness, the kind that precedes a seismic shift in weather. Elias steps back from the lean-to, sensing something larger forming beyond the tree line. The storm is reorganizing, shaping its power into a single concentrated burst. He watches the snow rise in thin columns along the ridge and feels the pressure settle in the air. At first light, the storm will reveal whether his adjustments were enough, or whether the lean-to will face a diagonal gust capable of undoing everything he built. Dawn in the frontier doesn't arrive gently. It pushes through the remnants of the night like a verdict carried on pale light. When the storm finally weakens, its silence feels heavier than its noise. Elias Branton emerges from the grueling hours inside his shelter to find a world reshaped by the storm's power, a white landscape carved into unpredictable forms. Few scouts in early wilderness history ever witnessed what he is about to see. Fewer still survived to reflect on it. The first hints of morning creep across the sky, casting faint blue illumination on the valley. Elias shifts inside the lean-to, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from hours spent bracing against the storm's constant pressure. The air within the shelter is cold, but strangely calm, as though the storm's anger never reached inside. A thin layer of frost coats the bark overhead, evidence of the temperature drop during the darkest part of the night. Elias brushes off the frost and presses a hand against one of the ribs. The wood remains solid, firm, and unbroken. Despite every gust, every shift, every unpredictable wave of pressure, the lean-to still stands. He crawls out of the shelter, squinting against the sudden brightness of the dawn. The valley stretches before him like a frozen sea. Drifts rise in mounds 2 to 4 feet high, sculpted into sweeping curves by the storm's relentless winds. The contours look almost artistic, though their shapes tell a deeper story, one of airflow, force, and survival. Elias moves slowly across the snow, testing every step, knowing that soft pockets can hide beneath freshly fallen layers. His boots sink slightly, but the snowpack below is dense, hardened by the storm into a compacted surface that offers steady footing. He turns back toward the lean-to and studies it from a distance for the first time. The structure blends with the landscape, its ribs and bark covered in frost, its form curved like a natural extension of the roots behind it. Snow clings to the windward side in thick patches, but the integrity remains intact. The angled bark sheets guide sunlight across the structure, casting shadows that highlight the precision of the build. Elias steps closer, inspecting the seams and seals. The packed snow has hardened into a cold, protective skin.
The pine boughs remain wedged securely. The braces show no signs of shifting. The storm tested every detail, but the lean-to endured. He moves around the shelter, examining how the snow accumulated at different points. Near the back, the frozen berm he built is now thick enough to act like a natural buttress. The drift has grown into a mound nearly 3 feet high, adding extra stability to the lower ribs. The trench he carved the previous day is still visible, its curved shape redirecting the tail-end gusts that swept through before dawn. Snow remained banked along the trench wall, showing how the wind followed the channel rather than slamming into the lean-to. Each feature of the structure tells a story of strategy and adaptation. Though the storm has passed, Elias knows survival is not measured by the storm's intensity alone, but the lessons revealed in the aftermath. He kneels beside the ridgepole and places both hands on it, feeling how the wood reacts under calm conditions. The ridgepole shows no warping or splitting. Its natural curve allowed it to shift with the wind rather than against it, much like the wind-shedding shelters used by northern tribes. Elias thinks back to those techniques, passed quietly through generations of observers who studied storms long before settlers arrived. In moments like these, he feels the connection between his own survival and the knowledge of others who once walked the same wilderness. He steps behind the lean-to, his breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. The storm's quiet aftermath carries an eerie serenity, a stillness that only follows extreme weather. He notices subtle cracks in the snow, radiating outward like veins. These cracks reveal where pressure waves struck the ground during the storm's peak. He studies them carefully, reading their angles and distances. Each one reflects the storm's inner workings, its hidden tremors, its shifting lines of force, its unpredictable bursts.
He returns to the front of the lean-to and crouches near the entrance. The interior remains noticeably warmer than the outside air, evidence of how the snow sealed trapped his body heat through the night. The interior temperature seems roughly 8 to 12 degrees warmer than the raw air outside, enough to make the difference between freezing and enduring. He runs a hand along the inside wall, feeling the subtle give of the ribs. The structure breathes with the valley now, alive in its own quiet way. Elias acknowledges that the shelter succeeded not because it resisted the storm, but because it cooperated with it. As he stands, he surveys the valley once more. Dawn has fully settled, casting long golden beams across the snow, illuminating ridges and hollowed pockets of frozen air. The storm has left behind a landscape both beautiful and treacherous. Large drifts rise at strange angles, indicating where the wind curled around hidden contours of the terrain. Some drifts slope sharply, suggesting the wind reached near horizontal force during the height of the storm. Elias studies the ridge where the storm first descended the previous day. A dark line runs along its crest, where wind scoured the snow completely, exposing patches of frozen ground. He climbs part way toward it, tracing the storm's path with measured steps. Snow crunches beneath his boots, each sound sharp in the morning stillness. As he approaches the ridge, he feels a faint chill different from the ordinary cold. It carries the lingering presence of the storm's breath, as though the valley still remembers the chaos of the night. At the ridge's edge, Elias stops. The sight before him is unlike anything he anticipated. Beyond the slope lies a deeper section of the valley, hidden from him during the storm. The snow there is not shaped like the drifts around his lean-to. Instead, it compresses into long raised seams, lines that stretch for several yards in a pattern that seems almost intentional. Elias kneels, trying to understand the meaning. The storm didn't just pass through this section, it collided with something powerful enough to alter its movement.
He examines the pattern more closely. The lines run parallel, like ribs of a massive buried shape. They formed where the storm's force met resistance strong enough to cause the wind to rebound sharply. Elias touches the snow and feels the density beneath, thicker and heavier than the drifts above. This area absorbed the storm's deepest pressure, bearing the force that might have destroyed the lean-to if directed elsewhere. He rises slowly, piecing together the realization that forms in the quiet dawn light. The storm behaved differently here for a reason. Something in the terrain redirected its energy in ways that protected the lean-to unknowingly. Elias understands now that the valley holds more secrets than he first assumed. It guided the storm, shaped its fury, and ultimately sheltered him in ways he could not have predicted. He takes a step back, his breath catching slightly as he considers what lies beneath the snow. Whatever influenced the storm's movement may hold lessons older than the frontier itself. What waits beyond the ridge, hidden beneath the snow's sculpted seams, will force Elias to rethink everything he believed about the storm, the valley, and the forces that guided him through the night.
Every survival story delivers a lesson, but few offer a doctrine, something that reshapes how wilderness knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. As Elias Branton studies the valley's strange sculpted seams, he realizes the storm did more than test a shelter. It revealed principles older than the frontier itself, truths carved into snow by wind, terrain, and instinct working together. What he uncovered tonight is not just a victory of endurance, it is a blueprint for weathering disasters no settler imagined. Elias stands atop the ridge, watching sunlight creep along the valley floor. The morning light skims across the snow seams, revealing their depth and alignment with greater clarity. Each line slopes downward toward the center of the valley, as though invisible hands had shaped the snow into channels. He crouches again, brushing the surface with deliberate care. Beneath the crusted layer lies compressed snow, denser than anything he has seen after a storm of this scale. It feels almost like a frozen shell, hardened by the weight of converging pressure waves. Elias studies the contours and realizes these lines mark where the storm split and rejoined itself, like two great rivers of air colliding and then funneling in opposite directions. He traces one seam with his glove, following its arc toward the slope above his lean-to. The pattern reveals something crucial. The valley itself served as a natural guide, pulling the storm's heaviest currents away from the shelter's location. What he had first assumed was luck turns out to be the result of terrain design, subtle contours the valley had shaped over centuries. A scout who understood these contours could predict wind behavior long before a storm arrived. Elias feels a deep respect for the landscape settle into him. He survived not only through skill, but through listening to the valley's silent instructions. He rises to his feet and walks along the ridge, observing how the seams shift direction as they approach different formations of earth and rock. Some seams twist sharply, showing where a hidden rise or buried boulder redirected airflow. Others fade into gentle curves, marking places where wind pressure dissipated into open space. The valley speaks through these features, revealing its logic in patterns that few travelers take time to notice. Elias realizes that while his lean-to endured because of careful construction, it also survived because he chose a location shaped by natural forces he barely understood until now. The wind picks up slightly, gentle, harmless, almost reflective. It brushes his coat as he surveys the frozen expanse. Elias senses the storm's echoes in the air, faint but meaningful, like the closing notes of a long, intense performance. He looks down at the lean-to, its curved back glistening under the sunlight. Frost clings to its bark like silver scales. The structure appears small from this distance, humble in shape, yet it stands as a testament to a night of relentless pressure and calculated choices. Elias descends the slope slowly, his thoughts shifting from observation to reflection. With every step, he feels the weight of what he has learned settling into something more structured, principles that might one day guide others facing storms even stronger than this one. When he reaches the lean-to, he runs his hand along the ridgepole, feeling the chilled surface beneath his glove. The curve of the wood, once chosen for its shape alone, now feels symbolic of everything he witnessed in the valley. Flexibility, alignment, intentional placement. These qualities saved him. He steps inside the shelter again, experiencing its interior with new awareness. The ribs form a protective arch overhead, their bends smoothed by frost, yet still strong. Snow seals remain solid along the edges, hardened overnight into a natural armor. The pine boughs create an insulated layer that still clings to the structure. Elias senses not the fragility of a temporary shelter, but the enduring logic behind its design. The storm had pushed, prodded, and tested every joint, and the lean-to had responded with borrowed wisdom from the valley itself. As he considers the next steps of his journey, he realizes that the night has given him more than survival. It has given him a codified doctrine. These principles are not new inventions, but rediscoveries drawn from instinct, observation, and the silent teachings of older wilderness cultures. Elias begins sorting these principles in his mind, testing their clarity as he imagines explaining them to another traveler. He considers the first principle: the terrain must lead. A shelter built without reading the land is a shelter built in defiance of forces far greater than human understanding. The second principle: wood must bend, not resist. Rigid structures fail under shifting winds, but curved and flexible ones adapt. The third: wind should be encouraged to slide, not crash. Angles matter more than size. The fourth: sealing is a living process, one that adjusts as weather shifts. Snow and bark become allies when placed with purpose. The fifth: airflow must be disrupted, not blocked. Pine needles, uneven surfaces, and trenches serve as partners in scattering pressure. The sixth: bracing requires more than symmetry. Reinforcement should counter not only expected forces, but surprising ones. And finally, the seventh: storms reveal truths about the land. A valley's seams are not random, they carry the memory of dozens of storms before this one. Elias repeats the principle softly in his mind, ensuring each one feels grounded in the experience rather than improvised. These rules form a legacy he will carry into future storms and perhaps one day share with scouts who might face similar battles. The lean-to stands behind him, reflecting the calm after the storm. The land ahead stretches into open terrain, shaped by dawn light and lingering cold. He breaks the lean-to's entrance seal gently, allowing fresh air to flow into the interior. The sun's warmth touches the bark, creating faint lines of melting frost that slide down the ribs. Elias takes one last look at the shelter that guarded him through the night. Its form blends with the roots and snow, almost as if it has always been a part of the valley. He steps back from it, feeling a subtle shift inside himself. Survival is not just the act of enduring, it is an exchange between person and wilderness, a conversation where the land speaks through storms and the scout responds through instinct. Elias understands now that the valley did not merely protect him, it taught him how to read it more clearly than ever before. He gathers his pack and prepares to continue his journey. The sun climbs higher, revealing the valley's complex textures and hidden knowledge. A new day begins, carrying the promise of movement and the memory of a night that reshaped his understanding of nature's power. Beyond the ridge, the American wilderness waits, vast, instructive, and ready to challenge the next scout bold enough to listen to its storms. Elias Branton walked away from the valley not as a man who survived a storm, but as one who learned its language. The night taught him that the wilderness favors those who observe rather than resist. His lean-to stood because he understood the land's quiet instructions and carried those lessons into every mile that followed. In the end, the storm did not break him, it shaped him. If stories like this deepen your respect for the wilderness and the people who once charted it, let others experience it too. Pass it along to someone who loves the frontier as much as you do. And if you want more journeys that reveal the hidden logic behind storms, shelters, and survival, make sure you're here for the next one.
Every episode takes you deeper into the untamed heart of America.